Dr. Choi is widely recognized to have regained the trust of the university community, alumni, legislators, and Missourians by changing the attitude of the entire state towards higher education. Please give President Choi a warm welcome.
Thank you. I wish I could join you there in person at the Newman Center, but Jennifer, thank you. I want to thank members of our community who are committed to developing stronger partnerships with Africa. And I want to thank the members of AGPSA for awarding me the Leadership Award. It's an honor for me to receive that award, and I will continue to advocate and support our partners from Africa. Also, I want to thank the Africa Hub Advisory Board, led by Dr. Wilson Majid, CAFNR leaders, and Dean Chris Stalbert, as well as Dr. Kerry Clark, and once again, AGPSA. Now, the reason that I'm excited about this partnership is that this university has been a university that's committed to improving the lives of others. And that was the founding motto back in 1839. And it was reaffirmed when this university became a land-grant university as part of the Morrill Act. And throughout that process, the university's research, education, and teaching brought benefits, especially for the sons and daughters of toil, as they were called, individuals who didn't have the means to attend a university for classical education, and providing them with the skills that they need in agriculture and the mechanical arts, and then expanding to the humanities, arts, and social sciences. But this university has had a reach that's far greater than the boundaries of Missouri. And my home country, where I was born in South Korea, which was devastated after the wars in World War II, the Japanese occupation, as well as the Korean War, my countrymen benefited so much from the generosity of faculty and staff here at the University of Missouri, as well as citizens of Missouri. And many students came here for their undergraduate and graduate degrees and then returned back to South Korea to help rebuild that country. And that is why the relationship has been so strong with South Korea and the University of Missouri. In the same way, starting from 20 to 25 years ago, a contingent of outstanding graduate students have been coming to the University of Missouri to pursue primarily graduate degrees in engineering and ag economics, to name a few of the areas. And we hope in the same way that they will return back to Africa, if that is their choice, to develop their country so that they can have the livelihoods for the citizens that will ensure sustainability. And we hope to develop that partnership not as a one-way avenue with knowledge coming from people that live in Missouri to our colleagues in Africa, but there's so much that we can learn from our African colleagues, our African graduate students. And whether it's to meet the grand challenges of water, food, climate, technology, we can all benefit by having the diverse perspectives that is brought to bear when we have people who come from different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. So I'm very excited about today's talk and excited about the opportunity to support the Africa Hub and to continue this important dialogue so that we can improve the University of Missouri to benefit the citizens of Missouri, but at the same time, have an impact in benefiting Africa throughout the continent of Africa. So with that, let me thank you once again for inviting me. I hope to be there in person next year when we have the 6th Africa Focus on Africa Hub, and look forward to seeing you on campus.
Thank you,
Jennifer, thank you.
Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Mazino Dixon, who will be introducing our speaker. Mr. Mazino is a practicing journalist from Nigeria for over 15 years. He has worked in various capacities in national institutions, such as the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, the Nigerian Television Authority, the Office of the Special Advisor to the President on Niger Delta Affairs, Armed Forces Radio, and Voice of Nigeria. I may welcome Mr. Mazino.
Thank you very much. Without much ado, let me introduce our guest speaker for today's Focus on Africa, Dr. Admire Mseba. Dr. Admire Mseba is an assistant professor of Black Studies and History at the University of Missouri, Columbia. He is a historian of Africa with research interests in the agrarian, environmental, and economic histories of Southern Africa. He is completing his first book titled Society, Power, and Land in Northeastern Zimbabwe, 1560 to 1960. He's also at work with two new research projects. One is a study of international cooperation in pest control in the 20th century Southern Africa, and the other is a study of currency, that is money, and politics, again, in 20th century Southern Africa. This talk is based on research done for the second project. His presentation today is titled International Cooperation and Environmental Control in 20th Century Southern Africa, 1902 to 1970. For the better part of the 20th century, periodic outbreaks of red locust swarms threatened the whole Southern Africa region, except its southernmost tip. This talk is about international cooperation in controlling these swarms and the social and political challenges that underlined it. It addresses questions of the environment, African priorities, white settler power, knowledge production, inter-imperial, inter-territorial relations, decolonization, and anti-apartheid actions that scholars rarely address in a single narrative. The talk is based on archival materials from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, the United Kingdom, and of course, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, based in Rome, Italy. Please, ladies and gentlemen, let's receive Dr. Admire Mseba. You're welcome.
It's not always the case that one gives a talk about his research and the university president, the UN system president, and the MU chancellor is also present on that talk. And so I want to thank Dr. Choi for attending this presentation. As my fellow say, this talk is based on where I am doing on pest control and the politics that underlie them in the 20th century in Southern Africa. And so I want to open this talk by showing you a short clip. This video, this short clip, gives us a sense of the problem. Gives us a sense of the challenges that locusts pose to agrarian communities, such as those found in large parts of Africa. The short clip that I just shared with you shows a locust invasion that was in progress at the beginning of the year when East Africa and the rest of us had to get under lockdown because of COVID-19. And so the locust problem is an ongoing problem in parts of Africa up to this point. But the story that I'm going to talk about here is of a problem that similar to the one that we see in the case of Kenya, was being experienced in Southern Africa from about 1902 to the 1970s. But I just wanted to share with you the fact that the locust problem hasn't ended, although we as historians love to look at things that have happened in the past. And here, the video does show significance of locusts. They really threaten the livelihoods of people because they destroy pastures and crops alike. But the story really is about people and how people's relations are influenced by challenges posed by the environment. And so I want to start with the very basic of things, sort of locate where this is taking place. If you look on the map, to the right corner of the map of the slide is the world map, and the red dot that we see there is my attempt to locate Columbia, Missouri. I don't think I was really very successful, but that's where we are talking from. And the locust problem is in this part of Africa here, or at least the problem that I'm going to be talking about for the next couple of minutes. And the map on the bottom here shows the extent of the area that's infected by locusts. And in fact, that's a map of the locust invasion area between 1927 and 1945, when the whole of Southern Africa experienced a locust plague. And so that's sort of where we are and where we are talking and where this story is taking place. It's taking place between about early 1900s, 1902, 1904 to the 1970s. Well, I will not bother you with the academic sort of discussions of the environment and what that tells us about the writing of the history of the African continent. But I wanna just highlight the fact that although I will be talking about some kind of cooperation that started in 1904, locusts have always been a problem. So they are not a 20th century problem. They have always been a problem. And in fact, in other parts of the world, locust invasions are referenced even in biblical writings. And so we know that locusts have always been a problem for a very long time. But the locusts that we are going to talk about and the people who had to grapple with this pests were in Southern Africa in between about 1900, as I said, and the 1970s. And for the better part of that period, Southern Africa was either under colonial rule or, in the case of South Africa after 1910, under white minority rule, which was technically not a colonial setting, but still was neither a democratic or multiracial community, as you want to think about it. And one of the things that I want us to think about here as I begin to talk about early forms of cooperation is what the narrator said in the short clip that I shared with you. But while these locusts, when they swarm, are really massive, they are also very mobile. They can move across regions in a really short time. And so what that means is that effective control of locust pests has to depend on cooperation between different countries. Locusts as pests, highly mobile flying insects, do not respect national boundaries. But I want to also quickly point out that much of this early form of cooperation that's taking place between 1904 and 1927 has to be understood in its colonial setting. And so what are the forces that really pushed colonial states in Southern Africa to begin to cooperate in controlling this pest that they knew was originating from a number of places? One of those factors was, of course, the locusts themselves. The locusts were highly mobile, and therefore it made sense that people across the region come together to try and solve this problem, which was quite devastating to crops and to pastures alike. So they don't discriminate whether a community is wholly dependent on crop cultivation or it's a pastoral community. The threat that the pest causes is really devastating in equal measure. And for Southern Africa in the early 1900s, much of the efforts to control this pest, which would lead to cooperation, have to be understood in the context of its colonial, as I said, settings. That in fact it was the power of Southern Africa, especially in what would become South Africa. South Africa, as we know it now, was only formed in 1910 as the Union of South Africa, and after 1961, the Republic that we now know. But those settlers who had the voting power really were the individuals that pushed their governments to get some kind of solution. And part of that is we know that colonial settings were really exploitative, and they, both the colonial governments and the white settler landowners, had attempted to coerce Africans to work in locust destruction duties. But Africans, of course, wanted to do other things that were also central to their own livelihoods. And so part of that was a result of the resistance that the settlers and their colonial governments in the territories that would become South Africa were facing. And then, even when they coerced the Africans to undertake locust destruction work, they also quickly realized that the locust swarms were coming from other regions. So as soon as they destroyed the swarms that were in their territories, a few months later, new swarms would arrive because these swarms were coming from other parts of the continent. And so what both the locusts and the locusts showed, by moving across territorial boundaries, was the limits of attempts to combat the locusts when they appeared in particular areas. And so we see an early attempt to destroy these locusts. I think I'm using the wrong PowerPoint, so I might have to log off quickly and get to the correct one. Apologies for that mix-up. But what I wanted to say is that to the right of my slide there is a list of officials from Southern Africa attending a conference in 1906 to talk about cooperation to combat locust invasions, because by that time, the people affected by the locusts do understand that, these swarms are moving across boundaries. But this form of cooperation really is boiling down to basically information sharing and early warnings, and to prepare communities for the times when these swarms arrive and mobilize resources for locust destruction work. And for that reason, they are not really effective because, as you can imagine, by the time the swarms arrive, they are stretching the resources of particular communities. And, it's a different story if they are combating the locusts from the source, from the places where they are swarming. And so by the 1920s, we do have a locust plague that's reflected on that map that I showed you, the map of Southern Africa, showing locusts invading most of Southern Africa, from South Africa all the way to just south of the equator in the modern day Democratic Republic of Congo, as far east as parts of southern Kenya and Tanzania, and of course, the whole of South Central Africa. And these plagues really pushed the powers that governed or that ruled, presided over Southern African affairs. And these were Britain with most of the colonies, Belgium with its vast colony in Central Africa in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Portugal, and South Africa, which is by this time a dominion nominally under the King of England. And they have to come together and cooperate in combating the locust. And so what the first kind of, there were two forms of cooperation that accompanied this plaque of 1927. And it's not the only plaque that's coming in. At the same time, a year later, there's another plaque of the desert locusts that I showed you earlier on. In fact, originating from the same source where this plaque of the 2020s is originating in the Red Sea area of northeastern Africa, Arabian Peninsula. And so the first action that they do is to send entomologists to work and try to understand the ecology of the pests themselves, and come up with, some ways of controlling them. And initially they have to cooperate. So Belgium sends its own entomologist, Britain sends its own entomologist, and South Africa sends an entomologist to work in Portuguese East Africa, now Mozambique. And they began to collaborate, and then they began to share the information that they were gathering. But an important point to remember here is that although these scientists that are coming from the European metropoles are really supposed to be doing work, the real field work is done by the Africans. After all, it's the Africans in the colonies who know the pests and their ecologies better than the European scientists that are coming from the metropoles. And eventually, by the 1940s, they figure out that although the whole of Southern Africa is susceptible to these locust invasions, in fact, the locusts only originate in a few places in what is now Tanzania, what is now Zambia, and what is now Mozambique, and I think parts of Malawi. And so they figure out that they need to attack or at least destroy the locusts at this source. The scientists call this the outbreak area. And then the area that's invaded by the locust swarms, they call it the invasion area. And so they understand they need to come together, and then they have to mobilize resources. And so by the 1940s, the European powers, the two European powers, Britain and Belgium, together with South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe, come together and form an international red locust control service. And to my right here, you see the signature of somebody who might be famous to my historian colleagues, G.F. Malan, the architect of apartheid in South Africa, the Prime Minister of South Africa in 1949, appending his signature to the convention establishing the International Red Locust Control Service, and setting up this system that would eventually combat locusts using technology, basically aircrafts, pesticides, and trying to understand the ecology of the ecology in which locusts develop in Central Africa and Central East Africa, in Tanzania. And so the cooperation works fairly well in the 1940s and 50s, but there's something else that's going on the political scene. Post the Second World War, Africans are clamoring for independence from their colonial rulers. And by the 1950s, the call for independence has really gathered pace. The locust story is sort of entangled in these political currents, in these struggles for independence. One question that some of you might have is, by 1945, we have the United Nations organization, but the UN is really involved, or the Food and Agriculture Organization is really involved in locust control, in part because Britain and South Africa, and these were really the most influential players in this organization, resist the the UN presence there for reasons that I would love to talk about, question and answer. But one more thing, the organization established in 1949 is initially meant to last for about, its charter and its convention is meant to be renewed after every 10 years. And so by 1959, the convention has to be renewed. By that time, there is a speed up towards decolonization in Africa. In fact, by that time, Ghana is already independent. And Nigeria would shortly thereafter become independent. Guinea too is becoming independent. And so the pace of decolonization is really increasing. And the newly independent states after 1960, by 1964, Zambia, Malawi have become independent, and so is Tanzania in 1961, really begin to question if they really want to be part of an organization, although it makes sense to control locals, which includes South Africa, which, as we know from 1948, has made racial segregation part of the law. It has institutionalized that. These countries begin to question if it really is useful to be part of the same umbrella organization with, the racist state of South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe, and Mozambique and Angola, which are in fact provinces of Portugal at that particular time. So they begin to question this, and the story in brief is that they say something has to change. And so, because the sources of the locusts, these outbreak areas were headquartered in Zambia, the headquarters of the International Red Locust Control Service, this organization that established in 1949, is in Zambia. And the new Zambian president, new independent Zambian president, Kenneth Kaunda, first tries to make sure that, put pressure on the racist regimes down south in South Africa and Zimbabwe, by first denying the white, workers who have to come and work at the National Locust Control Service, work permits, basically, something like that. But by the mid-1960s, late 1960s, into the early 70s, the newly independent states of Southern Africa really take a hardline stance and simply want to break away and stop this kind of cooperation, because they feel that it's not good for the fight against colonialism and for the fight against apartheid, for them to continue to be part of an organization that also includes South Africa and Rhodesia and Portuguese territories that are denying Africans their rights. And so in 1970, we have the annual meeting of the organization, and things take the turn for the West. I think the two slides to the right of the two newspaper cuttings to the right of my slide here tell that story. And so we see here in 1970, basically, the independent states of Southern Africa say, we are going to break away, we are going to destroy this organization. And Rhodesian newspapers pick that story, and you can see here the title of that story when they announced the breakup of the International Red Locust Control, all black red locust, control. This is the new organization formed by the independent states of Southern Africa that leaves out white minority ruled states of South Africa, Rhodesia, or now Zimbabwe, and now Mozambique and Angola, which are still Portuguese colonies. And at that particular point, they turn towards the United Nations for aid, but that just brings them into another sort of set of international players that I would like to talk more about. And all of this, I think, is to say that at that particular time, by the 70s, although science really showed that there was need for international cooperation, the independent states feel that they couldn't do this with an intransigent or intransigent settler regimes in South Africa or minority regimes in South Africa and Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Really pushes them to just break this thing and reconstitute a new form of cooperation. I will end here and take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mseba, for the presentation. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to indicate either via Zoom. You could type it in, or you could just put up your hands, or also our Facebook viewers, you could send in your question.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Hi, Admire. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I'll really look forward to reading about this work. But so I guess mine was about kind of how this might fit in with a story of Southern Africa, and kind of what you lay out at the front has to do with pastoralists and how we understand kind of their livelihoods. But with the far more oft reported scenario is about miners and mine workers in this period in Southern Africa. And so to really think about pastoralists in this period through what you're doing is very helpful. But I was wondering sort of how both at the South African kind of governmental level and how regular people kind of conceived of the way those overlapping labor regimes worked, basically, and how they were both, maybe how they both might have been impacted by these contests over locus control, basically.
Sure. Thank you so much for asking that wonderful question, Mseba. Mseba is my colleague over in the history department, and we are the two Africanists there. And the question that she's asking is about, the economic system, or rather, let me call it sort of a political economy that's developed in Southern Africa that's centered around, the far more significant mining industries in what is now Johannesburg and Kimberley. And so, in short, what's happening is that much of Southern Africa is drawing some kind of a funnel towards providing labor for these South African mines. And so that's the familiar story that's sort of told. And so what I'm arriving at here is that certainly I should have pointed out that the video that I showed is for Kenya and Eastern Africa. I just wanted you to get a sense of how locals in the contemporary period really affect communities. But to get to your question, so the settler farmers, especially in the Transvaal, in the Orange River, in Rhodesia, and in Natal, are really the ones that are competing for labor with the mining capital, to get back to the familiar story of East of Southern Africa. And when locusts appear, not only are they already short of labor, these white-owned settler farmers that got the whole of, or most of South Africa and most of Zimbabwe until more recently. And so part of the issue is that, of course, the locusts threaten their livelihoods in the same way that the livelihoods of these farmers, in the same way that they affect the livelihoods of the Africans. But significantly because they have to draw in labor to combat these locusts. And one of the key problems that the settlers have, and part of the reflection of the colonial mindset that I didn't just mention yet was, I didn't want to get into the holes of this for non-historian, is that the colonial states actually want Africans to destroy locusts for free. They don't want to pay them for that. And of course, nobody want to work for free. And so the Africans refuse to go and work for free. And colonial states try to implement, to put in the pieces of legislation or ordinances to coerce Africans to work. This still doesn't work. They also try to coerce settler farmers to destroy locusts when they appear in their region. Now, that's when the findings of the 1940s become important, right? Because already locust destruction work is competing for labor with the more established, more remunerative, and remunerative here is relative, right? Mining industry. But when they make those discoveries that in fact the locusts are only originating in Zambia and Tanganyika, Northern Rhodesia and Tanganyika, and Portuguese East Africa, and they have to destroy those locusts from those sources, the labor problems is taken away in some way, not all, because of course those countries also supply labor to South Africa, right? But the task of mobilizing immediate labor is taken away from farmers in South Africa, because the colonial governments in Rhodesia and Tanganyika have to provide that labor. And of course, a whole other point that I didn't mention here is that locusts from early on, the key method of destroying these locusts is by using pesticides. But fairly early in the 20th century, these pesticides are resisted by farmers because it turns out that, whether true or not, but it turns out that there is a belief that the residue of the pesticides is killing livestock. And The farmers are up in arms with that. So once it's established that the locusts originate in Zambia and Malawi, the problem is exported to Central Africa and not to the settler societies of South Africa and Rhodesia.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's so interesting. Thanks.
We have a question in-house.
Yeah, I know you mentioned earlier in the lecture that between 1927 and 1945, all of Southern Africa suffered from locust problem. In 1927 specifically, was there any environmental or other type of event that precipitated this rise in locusts in the whole of Southern Africa? And was there previous periods or cycles of say 40 years and 20 years where the locust problem was very bad?
Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah. From reading the archival record, I haven't really pinned pinned exact ecological and environmental processes that lead to this spike into a plague from 1927. But I do think that there is in the record there is evidence that the locust swarms or the locust swarms almost always followed after a drought year. When there's a drought year and the next year there are rains, once those rains come in, there is a locust invasion. I don't think there was a drought that was going on there. It might have been there in Central Africa, in what is now Zambia, in Tanganyika. And I still need to confirm that. But I think what this simply suggests is that the measures of controlling locusts that have been in place for all those years, because the locusts, part of the reason why I ended up doing this thing is I kept on seeing locusts in the archival record when I was looking for land. The locusts were a real concern. And so there must have been something, I think a drought followed by good rains, which eventually led to a locust invasion that spread to the whole of Southern Africa. Yeah. Okay. There are two questions here from Zoom, so if I can answer those, that's fine. And then I'll come. So the first question says, Africans, like West Africans, are very connected to the Bible and Christianity. You did mention biblical references to locusts. Could you talk about the ways the local Christian biblically minded folks interpret the locust situation and how religion plays a role? The second question says, the locust invasion clip you showed at the beginning was from earlier this year. How does political will to cooperate between states compare now and during intercolonial cooperation you talked about? And one is from Dr. Majay, I think. So, in a different level that I would have given here, I talk about what I call vernacular discourses of the environment. And but this is for the early 20th century. And when I talked with a colleague in South Africa, it turned out that what I thought was a vernacular discourse peculiar to Black Africans was not even the case. But more often, when the locusts first appeared in the early 20th century, which was this period of colonial imposition, quite violent in the 1890s, as the colonial states are imposing themselves on African societies, the Africans do appear in the colonial record, seeming to be linking the locust invasions and the droughts and many other natural phenomena towards, the misdeeds of their new colonial rulers. Like basically misdeeds here, I'm being quite diplomatic, but basically the brutalities of these colonial rulers. And so when I was sharing this other paper that is not subject of this presentation with a colleague in South Africa, it turned out that the Afrikaner-speaking people, these Dutch descendants, right, in South Africa, did give a biblical interpretation of locusts, basically as punishment for people's sins, right? And so there is a religious, cosmological sort of explanation for those who are really into this kind of belief systems. The locust invasion clip you showed at the beginning was from earlier this year. The second question from Dr. Mache. Now, the institutions of cooperation, those in the National Red Locust Control Service, are still in place. There is another one for East Africa specifically, and I think there is another one for migratory locusts in West Africa. But again, just following those locust outbreaks from East Africa, it's not so much about the political will to cooperate that's causing those locust outbreaks. But I think it has to do with the situation in the outbreak area of the desert locust that infecting East Africa. And that outbreak area is in the Red Sea region of East Africa, the Horn, and the Arabian Peninsula. And many of us who read news know what's happening there, right? Yemen has been in a conflict for a very long time, and so is part of Somalia, right? And so what has been happening, I think, the logical explanation that I can give is that ecological control in those regions has been disrupted, and so locusts are developing there. But they show up in Kenya, right? So that's, I think, what has been happening there now that explains this spike of the locusts in East Africa. Yeah.
Okay, just there. Yes, I'll just ask a very quick question. Talking about the scenario of southern region as Zimbabwe at that time, we understand the issue of land politics where land is split between the white and the black population. Now, at the time the locust invasion happened, can you give us exactly what happened in Zimbabwe at the time, the impact it had on the two communities, and what was the colonial authorities' response to both scenarios?
That's a good question. And so, in short, locust invasion, so locust control measures were geared towards white settler agriculture, both in Rhodesia and in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. There are no questions about that. But locusts didn't really segregate between white farms and black-owned farms, right? And so even and especially, and so in the 1930s, for example, during the Great Depression, there is a locust invasion. That, in fact, that's part of the time when that plague is taking place, right? The colonial government responds by giving relief to white farmers, right? We have been impoverished by the Depression, and on the heels of the Depression, are also suffering from locust control. The same doesn't happen to the African farmers, both in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. So.
Okay, can we put our hands together again, once again, for Dr. Mseba? Thank you very much for the insightful comments on some of the interactions between the ecological system and the human system, specifically the international cooperation and locust control in Southern Africa. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. Just a few announcements. Our next Focus on Africa event is going to be on Wednesday, November 4th. Dr. Chalachiu Seyong from the Department of Pathology and Anatomical Sciences will be giving us a presentation on the discovery of jawbone in Ethiopia. We also have a film show on Thursday, November 12th. The title is going to be The Five Bloods. Remember, you're welcome to book a reservation to attend in person, or you can always join us over Zoom. And thank you all for your time and for your patience and for the questions as well. And thank you for our presenter today. We hope to see you next time.